Should the Denver Broncos take a look at the tight end position in NFL free agency? We tell you why they should, and we also tell you why they should not. You'll get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or if you want to watch us in video format on your phone, your TV, or your computer, you could do that as well. Hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. The clock is ticking with NFL free agency coming up, and we're looking at a multitude of things for this Broncos football team as it pertains to perceived team needs. We already know offensive line's a huge one there, but there are also some other positions maybe the Broncos could bolster, add depth, whether it be free agency, whether it be the NFL draft. So, Sayre, my friend, let's talk about the tight end position on today's episode of the show and dive into maybe why the Broncos should look at tight end in free agency.
Well, it's one of those position groups on the roster right now, Cody, where I feel like the Broncos maybe fans are a little too, okay with the way things are right now. And I think that that's one of the primary reasons why maybe they should look at this position in NFL free agency. Look, they're not going to go after the premier names at every position this year just because, we got the Walmart money in the building now and all those sorts of things. But man, you can't help but wonder, especially after what we saw last season, do they need a veteran to play along with Greg Dulcich, right? Because Greg Dulcich, a very promising rookie, I think deserves to be kind of considered the tight end one going into the season. But is it more of he deserves to be the tight end 1A to somebody else's tight end 1B type of situation? And right now, the big wild card is, of course, Albert Okwuegbunam. We don't know who the Broncos are going to re-sign, if anybody, at their own tight end position, right? They have a few free agents on the roster, notably Eric Saubert, Eric Tomlinson, Andrew Beck. All of those guys are free agents here in 2023, Cody. So you've got the top two, Greg Dulcich, Albert Okwuegbunam. I think even considering those are the only two guys on the roster at that position right now that have really any experience, I think that's maybe your primary case for this team taking a look at somebody in free agency.
I don't think it hurts to take a look either because, as you mentioned, you have Dulcich, you have Albert O, and Sayre, look, there's no guarantee that Albert O even makes the roster, right? You have a brand new coaching staff coming in. Albert O, if I'm not mistaken, is on the final year of his deal in Denver on his rookie contract this upcoming season. And there could be a scenario maybe where he doesn't make it out of camp, right? That's always a possibility. Not saying that's going to happen, but I also think that we didn't see enough of Albert O last year, which wasn't his fault. A lot of that we can talk about coaching. We saw him emerge a little bit once he started getting back in the swing of things. But, for Denver at this position, we know offensive line is crucial. Well, you know what any NFL team does when you do have some deficiencies or maybe some areas where you're struggling on the offensive line, you throw a tight end next to that tackle that might be struggling, right? So if Denver goes with a rookie offensive tackle at some point in time, maybe you need to have a guy who has some size to him. And I think you take a look at some of the options around NFL free agency, some solid players who are set to become unrestricted free agents unless they somehow get franchise tagged. It's going to be Hayden Hurst. Obviously, we know him as a tight end option. Dalton Schultz from the Dallas Cowboys. It appears that those two sides are going to part ways. Is he a true tight end one? I don't necessarily believe that's the case, but I do imagine, could you, Dulcich and Dalton Schultz as kind of that 1A, 1B in a sense. You have a combination of guys who can block, who have size, but are also extremely athletic. So I want to throw that out there. It might be pricey for a guy like Dalton Schultz, considering maybe what he made last year on the franchise tag. Then there's Austin Hooper and even Mike Gesicki, who's leaving the Miami Dolphins. And I just don't think at this point in time we've seen Mike Gesicki be athletic and be the guy, who's making these crazy acrobatic catches and these mossing touchdowns. But I think the way that we've seen things specifically with Sean Payton, I would not be shocked if he goes out and tries to make a Jimmy Graham type move with one of these guys, as we saw. But now, you don't have to trade. You can get him in free agency.
I was just thinking about Jimmy Graham as you were talking about that, Cody. And the great thing about Sean Payton's time in New Orleans, and we know Sean Payton's not the general manager of the team, but I think he is, and his coaching staff, they will have quite a bit of influence with the pro scouting department. Obviously, Sean Payton working hand in hand with general manager George Payton. You look at Sean Payton's rosters through the years, and his tight end position has been pretty wide ranging, to be honest with you. You've got guys like Jimmy Graham and Jared Cook, maybe very similar in that regard. And then you've got, obviously, these last couple of years, Taysom Hill being thrown into the position, Adam Troutman. You've got a number of different players over the years. Even Dan Campbell once played for Sean Payton. So it's just a really diverse background for some of these guys that played for him at the position that kind of leaves things wide open. Like, it's not like, oh yeah, Sean Payton's going to go after this big inline blocking guy. That's what he typically targets. Or even I don't know if you could even typecast a Jimmy Graham type. It's like, it's been so wide ranging that you just don't know. I think there's something to this list, though, that you put together. Hayden Hurst from the Bengals, Dalton Schultz, Austin Hooper, Mike Gesicki. I would even throw Irv Smith Jr. in there as a bit of a wild card, a former Vikings draft pick when George Payton was there out of Alabama. So I think there's guys out there that could be intriguing for the Broncos that they need. It's not exactly the same as QB to me, Cody, where I think you need a contingency plan. It's very similar, though, in a lot of ways, because remember, Greg Dulcich last year, he hurt that hamstring in OTAs, and he dealt with it for most of the year and most of the season, right? So that's a huge red flag, and it kind of you need to raise the floor of that room behind obviously your very talented second-year player, Greg Dulcich, and that's probably not necessarily going to come with a third or fourth or later round draft pick. I think free agency is a spot where the Broncos can get a tight end 1A, 1B type of situation going here, and there's names out there.
Well, it's not like they're going to go out and spend big-time money, right? Because how many guys are like Travis Kelce? As we all know, is the premier tight end talent in the league. There really aren't any guys hitting free agency that are going to bring that kind of allure that I don't even think have the same kind of potential that a guy like Travis Kelce does. That's why I think you need a guy who can complement, as you mentioned, Greg Dulcich. And heck, maybe that could be Albert Okwuegbunam on the roster. Maybe the Broncos do bring back an Eric Saubert guy, a guy who can play some offense, but also be one of your key special teams players. That's also going to have to factor into it. And so for new tight end coach Declan Doyle, I'm excited to see what Sean Payton, George Payton, and Doyle come up with in terms of their scouting process, not only from pro players in NFL free agency, but the NFL draft. And these are all reasons why we believe the Broncos should take a look at the tight end position in free agency, which kicks off next week. We'll have all the action of free agency frenzy, all the coverage, everything that the Broncos do here. Locked On Broncos, this is the place to be. To the point, no muss, no fuss. This is it. And on today's episode of the show, we're also going to look at maybe why the Broncos should not look at a tight end in NFL free agency. You're going to get that on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, and the midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use, and then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained in a game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay, so don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Why should the Denver Broncos not take a look at the tight end position in NFL free agency? We're going to ponder that on today's episode of the show. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sayre, continuing on with this, we just played kind of devil's advocate here in the last segment. We talked about why we believe, and good reasons, why the Broncos should maybe take a look at the tight end position in free agency. But now let's look at the other side of it. Why shouldn't they look at tight ends here in free agency?
Well, the number one reason is definitely going to be the fact that this year's draft class is very good at the tight end position. I mean, I was listening to the guys talk at the scouting combine, and by the way, I mean, if you just listen to Daniel Jeremiah talk about these prospects during the scouting combine, Cody, you just sit there and you just, even if you're not watching, if you're just listening to him talk, you're going to be much more educated about this year's draft class. The dude is just he is A+ at his job, and I absolutely love listening. And he talked this tight end class up in a big way. Remember, last year Greg Dulcich was his number one tight end. Well, now he's saying that this year's draft class, he said this over the weekend, he said that this year's class may have upwards of 10 eventual starters at the tight end position. So that's really high praise for a class of tight ends, especially considering the fact that the last few tight end classes just haven't been all that great, right? Dating back to, I guess you could look all the way back to 2019. Remember where the Broncos traded up, traded down, traded all those different things, and they got Noah Fant. They traded back with the Steelers that year. They didn't trade up. So that was a great tight end class. It hasn't been like that since then. So if you got a great tight end class, you set yourself up really well to say, hey, we can pass on the free agents here and we can look to the NFL draft. But there again, you do have some limited assets in the NFL draft. So I think that's the number one reason as of right now why you maybe just don't look to those big name guys at tight end in free agency.
Well, another thing as well that I was looking at just with the combine, it just seems like at every position, right? Defensive end, edge rusher, offensive line. Heck, we got offensive tackles who almost have like a 40-inch vert. Like, athletes are testing off the charts now at the NFL Scouting Combine, and it's crazy to see some of the numbers. And shout out to our good friend Kent Platt over there, Math Bomb on Twitter for RAS. For us, when we evaluate the NFL draft, when the Broncos do pick in rounds 3, if they get any more capital in the first or the second round, something to be pondered here, we are definitely going to take a look at who they select and what type of RAS score that they have, relative athletic score. Those traits are super important. I think really the basis of it is explosiveness. And yes, in terms of what Daniel Jeremiah has said about this year's tight end class, I think it is worth maybe looking at. But yeah, you're right. Denver's in a little bit of a pickle here. This could even be a reason maybe why they should look at a tight end in free agencies, because you don't have that much draft capital unless you start making some draft day trades where you move back, acquire more picks. You could see that. But I think the biggest thing is, what did the Broncos do in free agency, right? And I think for everybody, and I want to put this out there for Broncos Country, because I know that there are a lot of fans that are like, ugh, why are we doing mock drafts? I promise you, we will not do a mock draft on the show until after free agency kind of settles. We're going to do a thing, unless the Broncos acquire more picks, we're going to do a thing called third round Thursdays, where we take a look at third round options with a mock draft simulator. But that's going to be really leading up to the NFL draft. It's not going to be right now, because we have to really see what Sean Payton and George Payton, they do in free agency to build a very strong team, or at least to help build a foundation that's going to give them more ground to stand on going forward. Now, I would also throw out this as well. If you know, as a coach, then Sean Payton is probably having these conversations this week with George Payton. If you think, okay, yes, I really like Dulcich. They brought in Bo Lowry, who can maybe help them figure out how Dulcich can avoid some of those hamstring issues once OTAs and minicamp and training camp come around, and even in season. I think that's going to be a huge focus, those soft tissue injuries. On top of that, I think you also have to ask yourself, too, Sean Payton and George Payton, is Albert Okwuegbunam a guy that you feel like can be explosive in the offensive design that you're creating here with Russell Wilson? We know his strengths, and that's to be a pass catcher. And it's not necessarily being an inline guy who's going to just be one-on-one against a pass rusher. I think previous coordinators, previous coaches have made that mistake with these guys. We've seen Dulcich lined up as an inline guy. We've seen him lined up as a flex wing where they can motion him across the formation. We've seen him lined up in the slot as the big slot, and we've even seen him put on the outside too. And you can do that with Albert O. So maybe you do look at some options in the NFL draft, particularly maybe an inline guy who really excels at that, or maybe you just bring back Andrew Beck, who kind of plays that fullback role. I think so much of it is going to be contingent upon how does Sean Payton use the fullback in his offense, and that kind of ties into that hybrid tight end spot that we're now seeing guys play with. So, Sayre, the question I want to throw out to you is, with the change, right, I think more NFL teams are kind of going away from the traditional fullback, but they're going with more of that H-back, the guy who they can bring up, they can lead block, they can line up in between the guard and the tackle, or in the guard and the center as a lead option guy. What are your thoughts here on maybe how the Broncos' approach should be in terms of tight end or fullback?
I think it's going to be that's where maybe somebody like Irv Smith Jr. comes into the mix, right? Because he's not your typical, 6'5", 260-pound inline tight end. I think he did quite a bit of those things at Alabama, and maybe the Vikings envisioned that for him at the NFL level as well. So maybe that's where you look to it, not just the fact that these guys, hey, if they're under 6'3" or under 6'4" or whatever, they profile better as a person that can flex and play some tight end / fullback / H-back, those types of things. But at the same time, that does make a bit more sense. I think that's something the Broncos have to consider here, right? And what Sean Payton's plan is going to be with maximizing the talent that he has on this offense in 2023, right? And what the other, the plans at the other positions are. We don't know exactly, hey, is Courtland Sutton going to function as a big slot at times? Or are we going to see, Courtland Sutton traded? How is the rest of the personnel going to affect the way that they approach free agency? That's why I think, Cody, as we're sitting here 1 week away from that legal negotiating period, roughly 1 week anyway, I think a lot of these deals could start coming in quickly and giving us some clarity as to, okay, here's the spots that they need to fill now. Here's kind of where the direction that they're going. I'll be very fascinated to see how they approach, because another reason why maybe people are saying, hey, don't go after free agents is like you want to allocate those assets elsewhere. If you do agree wide receiver needs to be adjusted or upgraded, that's an asset that you have to use there. And obviously the offensive line, defensive line, maybe safety. So we'll kind of see linebacker is another position group. So there's so many other moving parts here for the Broncos that kind of leads. Other people are suggesting, well, Sean Payton should just go get Taysom Hill. You got to remember, too, the Saints just restructured Taysom Hill's contract, so it's going to make it almost impossible for them to trade him this year. So I don't know that that's really an option. I mean, there's so many different things out there, but I think getting creative, like what you're saying, Cody, somebody that could play some fullback, somebody that could play some tight end, maybe line up as a big slot, those different types of things, maybe that's the type of person, it's a type of player that the Broncos will target at this position.
Maybe that's Albert Okwuegbunam, and we're just waiting to see and find out. And, as you always say, as our good friend Gary Kubiak always says, we are fixing to find out. And the dominoes that are going to fall in free agency are going to give, I think, us a better idea. Okay, this is maybe what they're thinking. And I think it's going to give Broncos Country a little bit more of an understanding, maybe how Sean Payton and George Payton work together. And I think we all agree, as we've talked about, offensive line is going to be a huge thing. George Payton's already come out and has said, hey, we need to rebuild the offensive line. I imagine it's going to be their priority. In which way do they do that? Free agency and the NFL draft, or solely on free agency, is going to be a huge thing. Could they trade for an offensive lineman? All of these will impact whether or not the Broncos do anything at the tight end or any other position that we're talking about leading up to NFL free agency. But Broncos Country, we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to get a pulse from everybody in Broncos Country. What do they think the Broncos should do with the tight end position this offseason, whether it be free agency or the NFL draft? You'll get that on today's episode of the show. But I wanted to tell you about what we have going on here at the Locked On Podcast Network. If you're a Colorado sports fan, we have a team for you. You're listening to Locked On Broncos, but if you're a Denver Nuggets fan, we also have the Locked On Nuggets podcast for you. If you're a Rockies fan, the season's getting ready to start. We have a Locked On Rockies podcast for you to check out. And if you're a Colorado Avalanche diehard, we also have the Locked On Avalanche podcast. And if you're a CU grad or you love the Buffs, we have a brand new Locked On Buffs podcast for you to check out every single day. The Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. How does Broncos Country feel about the tight end position and what the Broncos should do in free agency or the NFL draft? We got some very interesting responses from members all across Broncos Country. We just want to say thank you so much for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, Broncos Country answered the call once again. You put a tweet out there on social media asking them about how they feel about the tight end position. You got several good responses on this I feel like we can definitely address here on the show.
We did, Cody. Obviously, I think Broncos Country ready to talk free agency no matter what. So thank you all for participating in that, whether it's on Twitter, in the comment section. You're all so awesome, and we love reading response. It gives us great ideas too. A lot of times we get great ideas for what to talk about from all of your interactions. So thank you all for that. One of the responses that I got, Cody, is something we just discussed in the previous segment from Andre EEOR on Twitter. no, we're just fine with Dulcich and Alberto. That is where some Broncos fans are at. So I think that's an interesting mindset. Honestly, you know my thoughts on that. I'm a little more concerned about Dulcich and his hamstring. I'm a little more concerned about Alberto not being necessarily involved. There's a lot of unknowns there. I would personally prefer to raise the floor of the room as opposed to just saying, oh, no, we're fine with these two guys, unless that implies, hey, we're going to go get somebody in the NFL draft. But then there are some others who think maybe upgrade that room with a veteran.
Well, and I think we can even play this game as we get closer to free agency. We could play should I stay or should I go? That'll be a fun addition. We can even put that out to members of Broncos Country if they want to play and get involved. We'll throw out a name and they'll say, should I stay or should I go? And we'll play that here on the show. But I think going to that point, right, you mentioned some veteran options. I think at this point of his career, Eric Saubert is a veteran option. There's also a guy like Cam Brate, and this comes in from MT Scouting. He says, I'd go after someone like Cam Brate, who's set to be released by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It doesn't change anything at the top of the depth chart, but he's reliable depth and seems to be a standout locker room presence. Adding a low-cost vet for insurance makes a lot of sense to me because I think we can all agree. You don't have to go out there and get this guy who's this terrific playmaker that's just going to absolutely catch 10 touchdowns per season. You need someone who's going to complement your number one option, which is Greg Dulcich, as we all know. I mean, that's not even in question at this point. That's why I think you can also benefit from adding a vet, maybe like a Cam Brate. So I kind of agree with MT Scouting here. It's not a bad idea.
I think so too, Cody. It's a really level-headed look at things just in terms of, hey, not trying to ruffle the feathers at the top of the depth chart, but getting reliable depth. That's what I'm talking about, raising the floor of that room, reliable depth. And I like the fact they added in, standout locker room presence and at a low cost, right? So that's something that's really important here too. And also one thing that really doesn't get talked about a lot is, hey, if you're signing a guy to be your third tight end, that player probably going to have to play some special teams for you. So I think that's something that maybe should be considered here. Maybe look at, Pro Football Reference and see how many of these free agents have special team snaps in their career, which could, lead to somebody like Eric Saubert coming back. And that's what Broncos Edge _ says. If they let Saubert and Tomlinson walk, I'd like to see them go after a veteran that can be useful in the pass and run game. So if you lose Saubert and Tomlinson, you're obviously losing two of your better run blockers at the position, right? So you want to go after somebody that could definitely help you in that area specifically, as we know, right? Sean Payton, he's talked about it a multitude of times. They really want to emphasize the running game. And I'm not sure exactly, where does the tight end play into that? How much do they emphasize that blocking type of tight end, Cody? That's going to be something I think that we really maybe it plays into somebody like Hayden Hurst, like his value quite a bit there with the ability to be, all three phases, right? As a special teams, pass game, run game, somebody that can do a little bit of everything for you, maybe not spectacular at all of them, but, certainly very solid, rock solid in all three phases. What do you think if they let Saubert and Tomlinson walk? I think you need to replace them with a veteran that has experience as a, really dual threat at the position.
I mean, you have to, because tight end is a very physical position, and we've seen Denver last year. They dealt with some injuries at the tight end position. They had a multitude of guys working in. I mean, the roles were very interesting, and I think we can all agree that the Broncos and Nathaniel Hackett and Justin Allen, they didn't really utilize the tight ends as effectively as they could have. And I think in hindsight, you look back, and it's kind of like an eyesore, like, man, what if they were to do this different, right? Maybe Alberto plays the entire season versus getting benched. What would he and Dulcich look like together? To me, I think that's always intriguing. We know Dulcich got hurt at the end of the year, which opened up more opportunities for Alberto. Another name I just thought of, Robert Tonyan, could also be another guy, right? Because his best friend, Aaron Rodgers, could be going to the New York Jets. He could be retiring or stepping away. And I know that they have a financial situation in Green Bay that they might have to address. So Robert Tonyan could also be another option there. A guy who's physical as a blocker, can be utilized as a really good pass catcher, can even play some special teams for you. I'm not opposed to that. I kind of open to the idea, and at this point, anything is possible. I just like these responses we got from Broncos Country. They sent a lot of good stuff, and we just want to encourage you, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you comment down below your thoughts on what tight end options in free agency you want them to look at. Or if you don't want them to look at a tight end option in free agency, what do you want them to do in terms of the depth that currently stands as Alberto and Greg Dulcich as your top two guys, with Greg Dulcich being the 1A. I got to clarify that there. We want to know what you think, so drop it in the YouTube comment section down below. If you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, send us a tweet on Twitter at Cody Roark Roark NFL, at Locked On Broncos, at Sayre Bedinger. We have you covered every single day, every step of the way, to the point Broncos content and coverage every single day on your favorite podcasting providers and YouTube. On top of that, we're going to take a look at some other positions around the free agency cycle of things pertaining to the Denver Broncos. At safety, why should the Broncos look at a safety in free agency? Why should they not? You'll get that on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.